interesting, isn't it? Sure is. All right. Well, I'm preaching from up here this morning because I'm going to talk to you about the power of forgiveness. And I know there isn't anyone here this morning that doesn't need the power of forgiveness in their lives. You know, we have husbands we have to work with, don't we, Janet? And we have wives we have to work with, don't we, Ronnie? That's true. We have children and grandchildren to have to work with, and oftentimes we have neighbors and friends and co-workers and people in schools and so on and so forth, and so it just creates a lot of havoc for us, and we have to work with that. Well, the reason I'm back here this morning is because I have made extensive notes of what I want to say to you. And I know if I'd be sitting down there this morning, depending on memory, I'd not get half of it in. So I want to share with you, sort of help me here as we go along and listen real careful. John Ogelberg tells a humorous story about a softball league in Colorado. He said one day in the off season, this unfortunate guy who was the umpire of the league got stopped by a police officer for speeding. He pleaded for mercy. He explained to the policeman that he was a good driver and told this particular day why he had to be in a hurry. The officer didn't buy his argument. He just simply said, "Tell it to the judge." Well, when the softball season rolled around, the umpire was umpiring the first game of the season. Guess who was the first batter to the plate? It was the same police officer who ticketed the umpire for speeding. They recognized each other, and it was an awkward moment for the officer. The officer said, "So, how did things go with the judge?" And the officer asked him that question before he ever swung at the first pitch. But the umpire paused momentarily and said to him, "I can tell you one thing, you'd better swing at every pitch." With a menacing look on his face, the umpire replied, "Better swing at every pitch." Sometimes revenge can be deliciously sweet, yet most of us understand that vengeance is not a satisfactory response to being hurt, especially for those who follow Christ. For neither is carrying around a lifetime of hurt feelings. The answer, as we all know, to both of these is forgiveness. But how do we forgive someone who has hurt us? And how do we overcome the painful emotions and reconcile with someone who has done us wrong? That's what our lesson for today is all about. How do we go about forgiving one another? Simon Peter came to Jesus and said to him, "Master, Lord, how many times must I forgive?" Now, the Jewish law said you had to forgive at least 3 times. Peter said, "I've already forgiven 7 times. How many times must I forgive, Lord?" And Jesus said, one of the Gospels says, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. And so Peter turned and went away. But Simon Peter's question was a sincere one. He wanted to know exactly what the Master expected of him. The prominent rabbis of the day were teaching that one should forgive at least 3 times. Was that enough for Simon Peter? Simon Peter wondered, And then he asked Christ the important question, Lord, how many times? Some of us would like an answer to the question. Forgiveness is a big problem in our lives. There have been persons who have wronged us, and it's so difficult to let go of our feelings of anger, resentment, and hatred. How many times shall we forgive? Jesus' answer was, of course, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. That's a demanding stance. Some of us may feel it is asking too much of mere mortals, and yet Jesus believed it was looking out for our best interests. Forgiveness is to our benefit as much as it is to the person who has injured us. Our question for today is, how do we forgive? Forgiveness is a redemptive act that is essential to our mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It's not enough to simply have an act of civility toward a person who has wronged us, to let bygones be bygones. We must move from our hurt to reconciliation, or else we leave an open wound that is not allowed to heal. But how do we forgive? Let's begin by asking, why do we find it so hard to forgive? Obviously, one question is that the pain is simply too deep to forgive the hurt. There is a man whose name has been synonymous with forgiveness. It's retired South African Bishop Desmond Tutu. After the final defeat of apartheid in South Africa, Bishop Tutu set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by which black persons in that country publicly forgave those who had done them serious harm. It was one of the most stunning events in history. Literally, people who had family members tortured and murdered by police confronted the officers who had committed these crimes and publicly forgave them. Maybe the reason Desmond Tutu could be so effective in this role is that he himself had to deal with the very personal battle of forgiving someone who had harmed someone that he deeply loved. In a book titled The Book of Forgiving, Tutu tells how as a young boy he had to watch helplessly as his father verbally and physically abused his mother. He says that he can still recall the smell of alcohol coming from his father's lips. He can still see the fear in his mother's eyes. He can still feel the hopeless despair that comes when we see people we loved hurting each other in incomprehensible ways. He says he would not wish that experience on anyone, especially not a child. And so he writes, if I dwell in these memories, I can feel myself wanting to hurt my father, hurt him back in the same way he hurt my mother, and in ways of which I was incapable of understanding as a small boy. I see my mother's face. I see the gentle human being whom I loved so very much, and who did nothing to deserve the pain inflicted upon her. And when I recall the story, I realized how difficult the process of forgiving truly is. Intellectually, I know my father caused pain because he was in pain. Spiritually, I know my faith tells me my father deserves to be forgiven, as God forgives all of us. But it is still difficult. The traumas we have witnessed or experienced live on in our memories. Even years later, they can cause us fresh pain each time we recall. Some of you can relate to Tutu's experience with an abusive parent. It may have been a teacher or a friend or a sibling or a spouse who abused us. But somewhere along the way, someone has hurt us deeply, and we can still feel the pain. For some, the pain is so intense that it is simply easier to cut that person out of our lives than to forgive. That is one reason it is difficult to forgive. The pain is too deep. Pride can also get in the way of forgiveness, as it does a mistaken sense of principle. We think to ourselves, this will teach him or her a lesson. Then there are family members and friends who may encourage our estrangement. You sure you're not going to forgive him after what he's done to you, are you? You ever hear that? They probably mean well, but they may not understand their own need for healing. Pain, pride, other people, there are usually the reasons we do not forgive. And our inability to forgive can have devastating effects on us as well as others. Holding on to resentful feelings can shorten our lives, poison our memories, weaken our relationship with God, and even affect our own feelings of self-worth. This is an addition to the damage to the relationship with the person which we cannot forgive. Several years ago, a book came out entitled To Forgive is Human. How do we put your past in the past? It was written by 3 doctors who evaluated the various benefits that come when you move past resentment to forgiveness. These are 3 of those benefits. First of all, when you let go of past hurts and learn to forgive, there's a physical benefit to you. Attitudes of bitterness, hostility, and resentment are like poison and toxin to your body. Chronic anger and hostility can be more toxic to your health, say these doctors, than being a smoker or eating a high-fat diet. Secondly, there is a psychological benefit to forgiveness. People with anger, bitter thoughts become angry, bitter people, held hostage by their own bitterness. And finally, there's a relational benefit. Anytime you move in forgiveness and toward someone you consider an enemy, you can open the door to the potential of reconciliation. These doctors say there is a high price to pay for holding on to resentment and hatred. But how do we let go, and how do we forgive? That's the question, and let me suggest again 3 ways. We let go, first of all, by recognizing that forgiveness is a gift of God. We have been forgiven, and so we're able to forgive. You know, the cross just didn't happen. It happened because Jesus Christ, because God in Christ wanted it to happen. He knew very well that we could not bear our sin, that only Jesus Christ could bear our sin and wipe it away. Jesus followed his answers to Simon Peter with the delightful parable of a man who owed his king 10,000 bags of gold. Now, that would be, in our money, trillions of dollars. Gold today sells for about $1,000 an ounce. Think how much 10,000 bags of gold would be worth. Maybe trillions. Of course, amazingly, the king forgave the man this enormous debt. And here is the second amazing thing. This same man who had been forgiven this enormous debt had an acquaintance who owed him 100 silver coins, perhaps worth a few $100s. And this very man who had his enormous debt discharged by the king could not forgive the tiny debt owed him by this acquaintance. To make matters worse, he had this acquaintance thrown into jail. Contrast. The contrast could not have been starker. A man had been forgiven $1 trillion, and he was unwilling to forgive a debt of a few $100s. Of course, Jesus was simply telling about one man in a particular place. He wasn't telling about one man in a particular place. He was talking about you and me. We have been forgiven by God. We are sinners saved by grace. We have been forgiven an enormous debt. If we can see that, it can be a powerful antidote to our feelings of resentment over wrongdoing someone has done to us. We remember just how much God has forgiven us, and we are enabled to forgive. It's like a little boy who had done something very naughty. His mother was quite disturbed by the behavior. When no one was around, the troubled little boy saw that his mother had a chalkboard on the side of the wall to record phone numbers when they came into the house and no one was there to get them. And they would write the phone numbers down and then erase them. And so when no one was around, this troubled little boy wrote on that chalkboard, "Dear Mom, if you forgive me, please wipe this message clean." He went to his room, and about 2 hours later he returned. To his great joy, he discovered that the chalkboard had been completely erased. The chalkboard had been completely erased. That is what God has done for us. Can we do the same sort of thing for people who have hurt us? We forgive because God has first forgiven us. In the second place, we need to recognize that forgiveness is the most powerful witness we have to the activity of God's grace in our heart and in our life. The great Christian scholar and writer C.S. Lewis struggled for many years to forgive a childhood teacher who had made life miserable for him. And just before his death, he wrote a letter to a close friend in which he said, "Do you know that a few weeks ago I realized suddenly that I had at last forgiven that cruel schoolmaster who so darkened my childhood. I've been trying to do this for years." I'm going to read that again. Been trying to do it for years. Excuse me. And each time I thought I'd done it, I found after a week or so later, it all came back. But this time, it was done. Thank God it was done. Lewis was one of the most influential Christian writers of the 20th century, and yet he was human enough to realize he was caught in this snare. He struggled to forgive this headmaster, but he knew that his witness for Christ would not be completely authentic until somehow he managed to forgive this one who had caused him so much pain. That was his final victorious testimony to the power of Christ's amazing grace. For there are some things that can only be righted with divine help. For some of us, the nursing of a grudge has become a deep spiritual problem. It weakens our witness to Christ's presence in our lives. Besides the damage it does to us personally, it prevents us from being effective in our ministry to others. We need to recognize that forgiveness is a gift from God to be passed on to others, and that it is the most powerful witness we have to the reality of God's grace in our lives. We need to recognize fully that forgiveness is a positive activity necessary to the healing and wholeness of our hearts. Reader's Digest once asked its readers to complete the sentence, "I never regret." And this is what 4 or 5 of them said. "I never regret the day I quit smoking. I never regret taking naps and leaving large tips." Kenya Ray. "I never regret serving my country." Sharon Parsons. "I never regret eating the last cookie." Christine Hicks. I like this one the best. "I never regret forgiving the person who caused me pain, which gave me relief I never thought I could have. Erika Jones. Erika Jones is a very smart person who learned about the power of forgiveness. I never regret forgiving the person who caused me pain, she said, or who gave me relief I never thought I could have. The Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt once had these words to say, "Forgiveness is the only power which can stop the stream of painful memories." I want to say that again. Forgiveness is the only power which can stop the strain of painful memories. It's true. Now, please understand, forgiveness is not a passive resignation to a bad situation. We do not shrug our shoulders and say, well, there's nothing else I can do, I might as well forgive. There's little healing in that kind of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a positive, joyful activity in which we change from seeing ourselves as victims to seeing ourselves as victors. Change from victims to victors. Forgiveness allows us to experience within our own hearts the power and the presence of the indwelling Christ. I'll tell you, over the years in ministry, I've come in contact with people, a few of them who were bedfast because of guilt and unforgiveness in their life. One comes to mind. It was in my first pastorate when I came home from seminary. I'd been there about 6 months, and finally one of the men came up after church and said, "Pastor, would you come and visit my wife?" And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, she's in bed 24 hours a day. She only gets up to fix a little food for the kids and me and goes right back to bed. He said, she is suffering terribly. I said, okay, I'll stop by and see her. And so I stopped by, told her who it was, and asked her if I could be of any help. She opened her mouth to speak, and when she did, it just came rolling out. She told me the whole story of how hurtful she had been in high school and how she had tried to forgive and she was not able to forgive. Well, to make a long story short, we talked to Jesus about it with her. She prayed. God came into her heart. And the next Sunday morning, she was back in the church. Well, friends, there is nothing that can take the place of forgiveness in your life or in mine. They can say, well, you've done all you can do. That's all you can do. That's not enough. Forgiveness is there. Christ died on the cross. That's what forgiveness cost him. You know that? It cost him his life. He died on the cross for you and for me and for others around us that we might be saved and know him in all of his fullness and all of his glory. Amen? Now, what hymn do we have, Janet? Let's sing Just As I Am. What do you say? But that's a better hymn for this message, I think. And if you're here this morning and you have something in your life you haven't been able to forgive and get rid of, why don't you bring it to Christ today? He'll take it away and give you your peace that you deserve. Okay? Shall we stand?